Okay, in this tutorial, I'd like to walk you guys through the process of doing some basic three-point lighting on this object, in addition to playing around a little bit with some of the default materials that are available to us here in Maya. Okay, so the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and turn on my film gate so that I can make sure that I'm appropriately framing this object for its render. Now, the object doesn't necessarily fit the best within this particular aspect ratio. So I'll go ahead and click on the perspective camera in the outliner. I'm going to go to the channel box editor and change the horizontal film aperture to 1 and the vertical film aperture to 1. I'm just going to drag over the divider between the outliner and my viewport so that it shows the entirety of this film gate over here in the viewport. And I'm going to go ahead and strategically place the object, and I'm going to set a camera bookmark. I'll click on View, come down to Bookmarks, click on Edit Bookmarks. That'll bring up my bookmark editor and create a new bookmark. I'm just going to change the name of this bookmark to Render Camera and hit Close. Now what'll happen is every time I move, rotate the camera around, zoom in, I can always default back to that bookmarked camera position by clicking on View, coming down to Bookmarks, and just selecting the camera bookmark itself. Okay, now before we actually do a render, I'm just going to click on my render settings, and I want to make sure that I will be rendering in Mental Ray as opposed to Maya Software. So go ahead and click on the Mental Ray drop-down. In the Common tab, I'm going to come down here to the image size. Now this preset right here does not have the same aspect ratio as is set up or specified through the channel box editor for my perspective camera in my Maya scene. So I'll go ahead and click on this preset. I'm going to come down to 1K square, and then we'll get that same aspect ratio. Now while I'm at it, I'll go ahead and click on the Quality tab, and I'm going to turn the overall quality from 0.25 to 1. Now while I'm also here in the Quality tab, I want to make sure that the Show Advanced Settings is checked. I'm going to click on the drop down for the legacy options. I'm going to go ahead and collapse the global illumination, but I want to turn on the final gathering. And what the final gathering is going to do is help us to better simulate how light would bounce around within this Maya scene. Let's go ahead and close that and do a render. All right. So with this render, we are going to end up having one problem. If I click on File, and I come down to Save Image, I'm going to go ahead and call this image just Test. We'll render that out as a JPEG and hit Save. If I come over to my outliner and go to the Images folder and open that up, you can see that there is a disparity between basically the values in the saved JPEG as opposed to what I'm seeing right over here in the render view. Now in the render view, if I turn off the color profile, I click on that, then I'm going to get something that's a little bit more one-for-one. But the problem with this is by default with this color profiling turned on and set specifically to this sRGB gamma, what the test renders that we would be doing in the single frame render aren't exactly going to coincide with what our output would be if we were to be doing a batch render. So one of the easiest ways that we can resolve this would be to click on Windows, come down to Settings and Preferences, and go to the Preferences pane, go to the Color Management, and I'm just going to select that, or I'm going to disable the Enable Color Management and hit Save. And then you can see that it disables the color profiling right up here. And what we see in the single frame render is what we'll end up getting when we output that as its own JPEG file. So I'm going to go ahead and minimize that. Okay, come back over to the render view, and let's go ahead and introduce a light source. Okay, so let's collapse that. I'm going to click on Create now, come down to Lights, and I'm going to go ahead and select a spotlight. Spotlights are nice, efficient lights. They're very configurable and kind of give us the biggest bang for our buck as far as the render is concerned. Now, right now, you see we get our little translation handle right at the center of the grid. If we drag that out, we can see this little cone shape, which represents our spotlight. Let's go ahead and start to position this. All right, I had to pause the video to take a phone call there. But all right, so I've dragged this light source out over here to the side. And now with it selected, I'm going to go ahead and click on panels, and I'm going to select look through selected. And what that'll do is basically, for the moment, turn our light source into something akin to a camera so that it is positionable like one of the cameras would be. I'm going to go into my attribute editor. And right now, what we're seeing, this little circle, shows us the section of the light source as to what we would see in light, and everything that's outside of that is what we would see in shadow. All right, and we can come over here. If I select the spotlight, we can increase. Let's see. Need to go to the spotlight shape 1 input tab right here at the top. We can increase the size of that cone. So I'm going to go ahead and enter in a value of 60 right there. And I'm just going to push that light source back a little bit. Now, if for some reason, this particular effect produces too much of an immediate contrast between what is in light and what is not in light, you can also play around with the penumbra angle. And I usually like to set that to be about half of what the cone angle is. And that would gradiate going from light and into shadow right over in here. All right, now let's go ahead and click on panels. Come down to perspective and select the perspective camera again. And I want to reposition this as per my bookmark and do another render. So I'll go ahead and click on that right up there at the top, and this will take just a couple of seconds here. All right, and so here's this new render, and I'm going to go ahead and save that so we can now start to compare it with all the tweaks to the light sources that we'll be doing from here on out. One of the first tweaks that I'm going to be doing to this render is I'm actually going to go back into my perspective camera, and I want to change the environment color. By default, it is set to black, and if I click on that swatch, I'm going to come over and I'm going to select just kind of a dark gray. Now, what the dark gray will do is it'll provide us contrast with the areas of the object that are in light, that have highlight, have halftone on them, but it'll also provide contrast to the areas of the object that are in shadow. So I'll go ahead and do another render. Right, this will take just a couple of seconds to complete, but we can see that this does a better job showcasing the model in general, as opposed to what we were dealing with right over in here. Now, when I'm dealing with a light source, I like to do a couple of things with that light source. One of the first things that I'm going to do is I'm going to adjust the shadows. So I'm going to collapse the depth map shadows. I don't want to use that. I want to use the ray trace shadows. And we're going to adjust these first two values right here. The light radius controls how soft the shadow is. If you look currently at the positioning of the of the light source and the subsequent shadows, you can see that they're actually really crisp. This is because that is turned all the way down to 0. Kind of my default go-to setting, I like to set it to 5, and that's going to help create a more diffused cast shadow. So if I save this, I'm going to just drag a little area over top of the model right here, and I'm going to do a regional render. Let that get rendered out here, and it's a little hard to see exactly what's going on, but this shadow is considerably softer, and you can see it more right over here in this area. Now, it's also produced a little bit of a graininess to it that is aesthetically unappealing, and we can adjust that by changing the shadow rays. The lower the number, the grainier the softer shadows will be. So if I increase this to a value of 25, I'm going to come in here and I'm going to grab the entirety of this object, or the entirety of that section of shadow. I'm going to go ahead and do another localized render. And you can see that the shadow softness works a lot more gradually. It's not as grainy and it looks a lot more natural. So we'll go ahead and go with those settings right there. Now this first light source that I've created is going to be our primary light source. In a 3-point lighting situation, we would call that a key light. So I'm going to go ahead and relabel that spotlight as the key. Now, when I'm setting up a couple of different light sources, I actually like to play around with a little contrast in terms of the temperature of my light sources. So for my key light, what I'm going to do is click on this color swatch, I'm going to go ahead and grab this default yellow color. Now it creates a very saturated yellow, and we don't want the light source to have that degree of saturation because the byproduct that it produces is a little too opaque for what it is that I'm hoping to achieve. And actually, I don't quite like having a straight up yellow light source. I like it to be a little bit more on the orange side. So I'm going to go ahead and drag this little radial slider over towards the orange. But right here in the center, I'm going to go ahead and click and bring that over a little closer to the white so that it ends up being more of a tint of this yellow-orange to the light source. And we'll go ahead and do another render. Okay, and it's just warmed things up ever so slightly. As soon as this is done rendering, we'll go ahead and save this render and just kind of scrub back and forth to let you see comparisons for, this is with the white neutral light source and this is with the warmer light source. Okay, something else that's kind of fun is to also play around with the shadow color. If you have warm temperature to your light source, your shadows will actually be the complement of the color of the light source. So because we're dealing with a little bit of a yellow-orange right here, we would be dealing a little bit with a blue-violet. All right, so I'm going to bring this right down around over into this area. And I want to keep it relatively desaturated and want to keep it relatively dark. If it becomes too saturated, it's going to look a little on the funny side when we render it. It's just going to be pushing a little too much contrast into the model. All right, so we'll let this go ahead and finish doing its thing. Okay, let's go ahead and save that one. All right, so it's really subtle, but you can really see a difference right here where we have a lot of contrast. Kind of lightens that shadow up a little bit and gives it a little bit more of a cooler temperature. Okay. Now, the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to add an additional light. Okay. With this 3-point lighting, the reason why it's called 3-point lighting is because it relies on 3 light sources. So we have the key light, which is our primary light source. I'm going to go ahead and just select the key light and hit Command D to duplicate that. And we're going to rename this duplicate as our rim light. Now what the rim light does is it simulates reflected light or bounce light in our object. I'm going to go ahead and look through that while I'm talking to you. I'm going to place it over here somewhere on the opposite side of our key light. And because we have our key light being warm, I'd actually like to give this one a little bit of a cool tint. And so I'm going to go ahead and select a blue. Put that about in there. I'm going to click on panels, come to perspective, and go back into our regular perspective view. And what this is going to do is it's going to help bring a little bit more definition to the contour on the opposite side of the object. Now this is going to take a little bit longer to render now because we're dealing with 2 light sources, and each of the light source is producing its own set of shadows. So I'm just going to go ahead and pause the video until this is done rendering. Okay, so this has essentially doubled our render time, but you can start to see, this complementary light source right here on the back side, and it just really helps this render to pop, or begin to pop, comparatively with what we were dealing with before. Now, I think both of these light sources, as they're currently set, are a little too low key. So I want to come over here to the key light. I'm going to change the intensity from 1 to 2. And I'm going to come over here and change the intensity of my rim light from 1 to 1.5 and do another render. All right, now while this render is getting started, I just kind of want to talk about the reason why I've chosen these specific numbers. It's just kind of based off of the rehearsal that I've done for this demo. You're going to find that you're going to need to kind of just do several different test renders with both the rim light and the key light, and even the third light, which will be the fill light when we get to that point, just to make sure that you have the settings correct as per your specific needs, as per the proximity of your light sources with your objects, the scale of the world and things of that nature. So I'm going to go ahead and save this so we can compare it with where we started, and I think that is looking a bit better. Okay. All right, so the third light source that I'm going to focus on, and I'll just minimize this, is I'm going to come back to my key light, and I'm going to duplicate that once again with Command or Control D. And I'm going to rename this one Fill. Okay, the purpose of the fill light is to soften the core shadows. So I'm going to click on Panels, come down to Look Through Selected, and I'm going to reposition that one to kind of face this object more directly. Now, something that I want to do with this fill is I want it to be be neutral comparatively to the temperatures on the other light sources. So I'm going to set the color back to white. I want it to have a lower intensity. And I don't want it to cast shadows, because then it's going to start to create conflicting shadows, trying to put shadows in areas where we don't want them to go, that would lessen the effect of either our fill light or our key light. So I'm going to click on Panels, come down to Perspective, and come back to our perspective camera and do another render. And I'm going to go ahead and pause this one. Okay, there we go. When I said pause this one, I was meaning pause the screen capture while this render occurred. Now you can see, I'm going to go ahead and save this. Scrubbing back and forth between just the two lights and the third light. That third light is really kind of blowing things out. It's way too intense with that intensity of 1. I'm actually going to try and set this at a much lower intensity, maybe a 0.25, and see how this looks. All right, this render is done. Let's go ahead and save that so I can scrub back and forth between having the intensity of 1 and the intensity of 0.25. So that does look a lot better. I'm going to click on this icon and delete the intensity of 1 and compare it to without the fill light and with the fill light. All right, and you can see how it's kind of pumping that neutral light into everything, including the halftone and the highlight, and especially in that core shadow. And I still think it's just a little too intense. So I'll go ahead and maybe set this at a 0.1 and go from there. All right, here we go. I've played around with the settings just a little bit more to customize it to get a better effect. I increased the intensity of my key light to 2.5. I also made it a little warmer still. I went to my rim light and I made that a little bit more opaque as far as the application of color goes. It's has a stronger blue tint. All right, left the fill settings alone, with the intensity set to 0.1. And then in the perspective camera, I went into the background color and gave it just a little bit of a violet tint, just to give us a little more contrast with the warmer temperature to our key light right there. All right, so and if you're just curious, I can go ahead and scrub back through some of these different states. I think this is where we left off last, and then you can see kind of where some of the iterations that it's gone through as I played around with those settings right there. Now, one thing that we haven't discussed is with the spotlight, by nature, the type of light the spotlight is trying to simulate actually has a little bit of a decay to it. By default, this decay is turned off on the light source. You can see where I have the key light selected. We're in the attribute editor, and you can see the decay rate is set to no decay. If you click on that, you have a couple of different options available to you: linear, quadratic, cubic. The linear kind of gives us the most bang for your buck in terms of what it produces for the turnaround time in terms of render time. So I'm going to go ahead and select the linear decay. Now, what's probably going to happen is it will increase our render times, yes, but this intensity now is going to end up probably being a little too low. So as I start my render, what I'm assuming is going to happen is that the light will have decayed before it has even hit my object, as you can see is starting to render right down in here. So I'm going to go ahead and press Escape and abort this render and play around with our intensity until we get it set to a good number for this particular application. So I'm going to just actually really jump the gun and go from an intensity of 2.5 to an intensity of 50 and start another render right here. Now the cool thing about this is the closer that the object is to the light source, the more heavily featured the halftone and the specular highlight would be, and then the farther we get away from it, it's actually going to gradiate from lighter values into darker values. in doing a better job of simulating how lighting would occur in real life. Right, so I'm going to press escape because this is still just a little too dark. If we scrub back and compare it with where we were at prior to turning on this decay rate. So let's go ahead and step it up even a little bit more. I'm going to try 75 and see how things are looking. All right. And I'll press escape. I think I could even step it up a little bit more still. All right, let's go all the way to 100 with the intensity on this light source and try another render. Okay, now I like the direction that this is going, so I'm going to go ahead and pause the video until this render is completed. Okay, here we go with an intensity of 100. And, whoops, if I just, sorry, opened up my calendar there by accident. If I scrub back and forth between these two, you can see it's a little darker still than where I started. But I definitely think that it's acceptable. And I'm relatively happy with the effect that this is producing. Now, it is establishing a little bit more of a focal point right up here on the top part of this lightsaber as opposed to what's going on right down here in the bottom section of it. But we're going to go ahead and go with this. So I will save that. Now, one thing I am going to do is I will click on File. I'm going to do Save Image. And I am going to call this one Test 2 and go ahead and hit Save so that I can open it up and just make sure that the settings are matching what I'm seeing in my render view for the single frame render as opposed to what I'll end up getting for my batch render right over here with that Test 2. All right. So that's looking good. So let's go ahead and minimize this and now start talking about different material types here in Maya. So I'm going to go ahead and click on this icon right down here. It's my 5th viewport option down. And that's going to open up my attribute editor, or sorry, not my attribute editor. It's going to open up my hypershade. Now here in the hypershade, I don't necessarily need my material viewer open for the moment. So I'm going to go ahead and close that. And by default, you can see that I really only have one real material. I have a matte material that's applied uniformly to this object right here. Now, a matte material, Lambert is our kind of our default matte material, and it does a really efficient job in being able to produce that type of shader effect. But what if we want a specular material on that? Then a couple of options that we have for a decent little specular material is a blend and a Phong and Phong E. And from my understanding, really the big difference between the blend and the Phong E is how the specular highlight is managed. And the specular highlight, if we're looking at this little preview right up here, is that hot little highlight on the object. I'm going to go ahead and click, or middle mouse click on that object until I get the plus symbol. I'm going to drag it over and I'm going to drop it on my object over here in Maya. And you can see how the form has changed. We have a different highlight on it now. I'm going to go ahead and do another render of this object with a specular blend material applied to it. All right, and this was the outcome of that specular blend material. So go ahead and save that. So you can scrub back and forth between the Lambert or the matte material and the specular material, and you can see a lot more pronounced highlight. Right in here, coming, especially through the cylindrical portions of this object. Also in some areas, you'll begin to actually see a reflection, as we're seeing right down in here. We're seeing on some of these flatter, more planar portions of the model as well. And so, it also has a fair degree of reflectivity, which is part of this default material. Now, another type of specular material is an anisotropic shader, where if you notice a difference in how the highlight is being managed from the anisotropic to the blend does a really good job of kind of simulating how plastics work. But the anisotropic does a better job simulating how highlights would work on metals, specifically conical form as far as metal is concerned. Let's go ahead and apply the anisotropic shader to this model and do another render. Okay, so this render is now completed with the anisotropic shader applied to it, and so we'll save that and scrub back and forth between the blend material in the anisotropic material so you can see exactly what it's doing with that highlight. Now, in both situations, I feel like the highlight is a little too pronounced for, the effect that I'm going for. This makes it feel like it has a high polish kind of surface quality to it. If I double click on the anisotropic shader, it'll open it up right over here in my attribute editor. And then I can go in and I can actually play around with the spread X and spread Y, and that will affect the way that the highlight is functioning on this material. So you can see that if I increase the spread X, I'm going to leave the spread Y alone, we'll get a much softer specular highlight right there. So I'm going to just do a regionalized render. So just drag a selection over what I want to render and go ahead and hit this icon right here, which is the regional render icon. And it's doing a lot better job managing that highlight. Now it's still a little strong right there, but you can play around with things like the specular color, etc., to be able to tone that down a little bit. Now you can also see a little bit of a reflection from this piece right down on here. And so the anisotropic is also a reflective shader. So just be aware of that as you're playing around with your settings. Now what I'm going to do is probably without a whole lot of commentary, is I'm going to actually apply a couple of different shaders and materials to this object just to give it a little bit more of a custom quality. All right, so first thing I'm going to do is click on Mesh, and I'm going to come down and I'm going to separate it out into its individual pieces and parts. So I'm going to create a new Lambert. I'd like this one to be a warm brown. And apply it to the handle right here. Double click on the anisotropic, it opens up in the attribute editor. And actually I want to give this one a little bit of a kind of a gold, a little bit of an off gold color to it. Okay, take this blend. I'm actually going to make this blend a bit lighter, like so, and apply it to certain sections of the model. I'll come back and apply that to some other stuff here in just a second. I'm going to create another Lambert material and just make this one a dark gray and apply it to a couple of pieces. Right, for this thing right here, I don't want this to be exclusively black. I want part of it to also have this this particular type of material right here, that light gray blend. So I'm going to go into smooth preview mode so I have an easier time separating some of my edges. Go into select face mode and begin selecting these faces for this button right here. Grab the paint select tool. Select those, right click on the blend, assign the material to the selection. Okay, I'm going to create another anisotropic material. I'm going to change my spread to 6 as well for this one. And actually I want to use the same color that I used in this blend. All right, which is, if I click on this little drop down, I can do RGB 0 to 255 and say it's 210 across the R, G, and B channels. And I'm going to go ahead and go with that for right now. So I'm going to select everything, go into smooth preview mode, click on view, come back to my render camera bookmarks, and do another render. Right here's my render. You can see that the highlight is a bit strong, so maybe our light source is ending up being a little too intense right there, or for our key light especially. So I'm going to go ahead and open up that right here in the outliner and maybe reduce this back down to 75. All right, and just let this just do a little bit of a regionalized render so I can see exactly what effect that I'm getting right there. And now I'm actually going to go back into my hypershade, and I'm going to come into some of these materials right here and play around just a little bit with some of these additional specular settings. I'm going to look at the diffuse first of all. I think I'm going to leave the diffuse alone. I'll look at the specular color, turn that down just a hair. Do another localized render. Okay, I feel like that one's working a lot better. All right, just went ahead and pressed escape to abort that. I'm going to come in and do the same, the specular color for that material right there. And then also with this blend, I'm going to turn the specular color down just a little bit as well. All right, still a little intense on this more silver part, so I'll just go ahead and select that. And actually, I'm going to decrease my spread there to 3. Do another local render. All right, and that's still not quite giving me the effect that I want, so maybe I'll take the specular color down a bit more. And part of me is wondering if it's the tapering that's occurring on this object right here. That where there is no tapering on this, it's probably the tapering is just, it's really kind of exacerbating the highlight right there. So I might go ahead and leave that alone because it doesn't look as quite as nice as I'd like it to from this particular angle. But I'm sure as it starts to actually rotate around, it'll start to look even better still. Maybe just play around with the diffuse setting on that just a little bit. I want to select a little bit more of this piece right up here and kind of use that as a baseline. Make sure that I'm not... Okay, so that diffuse setting was too strong. Let's set this back to 0.7, where by default it was at 0.8. Okay, I'm going to set this at 0.75. And I think I'm starting to get a little bit more of a happy medium right there. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and do one more final render of everything, and then we should be good to go for the batch render. All right, and here we go. Here's my final render. Go ahead and save that. Look at it at full scale, and then go ahead and send this off for a batch render.